Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. So Per, you tell me if you want, when you want, I can give you, well, I can see there are still some people in the other room, but they will.
Yeah, maybe you take the presentation and put up the agenda, maybe, so we don't have a gray screen.
Yes, I can.
If you wish.
Well, it's already 6:05, so it's.
Okay, we can start. But would you say something, or shall I just start?
Well, let's start. Thank you everybody for being here. Per, you are the boss, so go ahead. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome to this conference panel to discuss the important topic of big data, non-traditional data, and machine learning. And I would like to thank Bank of Italy and the Federal Reserve Board and the organizers, Yuri Marcusi and Giuseppe Bruno, Ricardo Carrere and Christopher Kurtz, for the privileged opportunity for me to chair this exclusive panel. My name is Per Newman Anderson, and I work as an advisor at the ECB. And the digital transformation is a fascinating opportunity to take advantage of the new digital sources and data science techniques to build new insights for policy and decision making. I'm in a stage myself of finalizing a book on data science in economics and finance, where Yuri and Giuseppe are also contributing authors. So in this panel, we have 5 distinguished and experienced speakers from the international central banking and academy community. And I would like to present, of course, Ellen Maid from the Federal Reserve Board, Tara Sinclair from George Washington University, Steve Hansen from the Imperial College London, and Marco Marini from the IMF, and Giuseppe Bruno from our host, Bank of Italy. We have around 50 minutes for absorbing the wisdom of the panel members, followed by a half-an-hour question and answer session. Now, a few organizational points for this virtual panel in order to save some time. So please turn on your chat function, where the panel members will be presented by the organizers. Each panel member will have 10 minutes to present their insights and recommendations on this topic. Hereafter, so that is 5 panel members, 10 minutes, 50 minutes. Hereafter, we then have half an hour for Q&A session. So please already now prepare your questions during the presentations and use the chat function, raising your name and question, and then we shall read this out to the panel members when we start the Q&A session. So let's start. Panel members, I give you the floor. So once I give you the floor, please share your screen, turn on your camera and microphone, and everyone else will mute. So let's begin and hear the insights. I give the floor to our first panelist, Ellen Maid. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, but I don't see that I have the option to share my video.
You have it, Ellen.
Yes, I have it. Thank you. Okay, so I'm hoping you're seeing my first slide. Could someone?
Perfectly.
Great, thank you. So I think thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's an absolutely fascinating time to be having this discussion. What I want to talk about today is the role that non-traditional data are playing in our current economic analysis. As you know, we're in the midst of an economic downturn and a recovery, but this time is different. Unlike the global financial crisis that started back in 2007, this downturn didn't originate in the housing sector, the banking sector, or even in the economy. The US economy was in terrific shape at the start of the year. Our unemployment rate was around 3.5%. It had been below 4% for almost 2 years and was the lowest since the late 1960s. Opportunities were available for many individuals who'd been left out of the jobs market before. So that was helping to narrow our income and opportunity gaps. And we were, at the Fed, were embarked on a initiative we called Fed Listens in the process of a monetary policy framework review. And we heard from many people across the United States and communities what sorts of opportunities were being available. So it was really a terrific time for our economy before, let's say, the end of February. So we've never had experience with a downturn caused by a pandemic before. We need a different way of monitoring things like health, which we don't typically follow, movement, geolocation, tracking our services and retail sector, tracking responses like social distancing and what activities have been discontinued. And it provided an opportunity for us to put in place the Fed's expanded measurement agenda that had started back in 2014. And I give a shout out here to Chris Kurtz for being a thought leader in this area. But this measurement agenda focused on timeliness and frequency and disaggregation and enhanced measurement of economic activity. So we've had an opportunity to think about that. Hang on just a minute, I'm managing multiple windows here. So since the start of the pandemic, we've been providing our policymakers with packages of high frequency information. And at the start of the crisis, it was financial information every single day, economic information, a large packet of both every single day. The frequency of that has slowed, particularly as things have more normalized and regularized, but we still send a high frequency indicator package to policymakers on a weekly basis. And this package contains a wealth of information on health, including at the state level. As you may know or may not know, we don't really have a federal policy in the United States about this pandemic. Most of the restrictions that have been implemented have been at the state or even at the local level. Counties differ in the state I live in. There are different rules across counties. So it's a very localized response. And our group is tracking that. And in things like testing, cases, deaths, and mobility data. And then we have economic data as well for all the categories I've listed there on the slide. And let me just, in the next couple of slides, give you a sense. I've just done a clip from our recent packet on the kinds of information. And this packet is very substantial, but it gives you some idea of what our policymakers are seeing. And that's the last slide on that. So let me go to the next topic, which is the area I work in, and is the area that I think is ripe with opportunities for language processing work, and that's central bank communication. So all of our central banks provide a wealth of resources for NLP research through very, very frequent communications. And so far, what I've observed is that NLP techniques can be very helpful for historical research, for understanding how communications affect financial market prices, for analyzing reports in banking supervision or in financial stability, regularized reports, maybe cross-sectional sorts of work. And one thing I'm interested in, haven't contributed to, is how might these techniques, NLP techniques, be used to craft our policy statements and messages? And I think that's an open question because NLP can be very useful for counting particular words and looking at usage over time, or using bag of words models to collect ideas about things, topic modeling to look at particular topics of interest. But we still have issues with defining meaning or intent, or understanding past, present, and future. And And I don't see a role at present for these techniques to be helpful for us inside our central banks with actually crafting our messages. And I'm distinguishing that from outside of the central bank, analyzing the messages ex post. And, you know, so we should keep in mind that we do aim to communicate consistently across time and across vehicles. So to use similar words or the same word similarly across different types of communications. So let me turn now to what we've done during the pandemic. Since March, our communications have not relied upon non-traditional data or methods, unlike the economic analysis that I referred to earlier, and I apologize for that telephone I can't turn off in the background. But our volume of communications has been unprecedented. You know, we moved very, very swiftly in early March, and by the middle of March, we were back to the zero lower bound. There have been a number of FOMC meetings, including some unscheduled ones, press conferences. The chair has testified many, many times on monetary policy and on the 13.3 facilities, which you may know we put into gear. And I think it's important to note here that the 13.3 facilities are a responsibility of our board, not of the FOMC, whereas monetary policy decisions are made by the FOMC. So let me focus on some key themes. This is the sort of last part of my presentation of the Fed's pandemic communications, because they really do, the messages we've been sending consistently differ quite a bit from things we've said before, just due to the nature of the crisis. So the source of the economic downturn is health related. It's not because of something in the economy. So here's some examples from mid-March. That was the meeting March 15th when the FOMC lowered the rate to zero, the zero lower bound. But the idea here is that it's the virus that's disrupted economic activity because we were doing fine before that. So that's one of our messages. Another message is the risk to the economy is rooted in public health. So that's going to be what weighs on economic activity and poses risks over the medium term. We've said many, many times from the very beginning that the path of the economy will depend on the course of the virus. The third message is that you contain the virus, that generates confidence, and people can get back to doing what they normally do. That started to be our initial communications around the virus were the virus and the downturn in the economy and so on. And then we started to shift, I would say around June. So I'm quoting here from the chair's press conference in June. But a full recovery is unlikely until people are confident that it's safe to re-engage in a broad range of activities. Our fourth message is you should wear masks and you should observe social distancing. We didn't go to this right away, but over the course of the summer, a number of the Reserve Bank presidents started saying in their public remarks that mask wearing was essential. And we've started to say that too, generally as an institution. And I would differentiate that from other parts of the federal message coming from the federal government. And the last is that it's not just the pandemic and the economy are not something that just require a response from monetary policy. And as you know, the Fed's been quite responsive very rapidly, but also fiscal policy. And we see room there for fiscal authorities or Congress and the administration to take further action in that regard. And as you may know, in the past, Fed chairs have at times decided not to engage on fiscal policy. It's not our ballpark. But in this case, we have engaged pretty clearly about our views of the role of fiscal policy and the fact that the Fed, while we don't think we're out of ammunition, we have more limited authorities we have no authority for spending policy. So this, I think, has been a very, very important message. So I'd like to end my presentation by offering to those of you who are interested in doing research on Fed communications, whether you could use NLP or NLP. It could be usefully used to pick up on these themes in our communication since March and identify change in the way we've communicated. So I'll stop now and turn my authority back to Per. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And we will keep the questions that are coming in to the Q&A session, and we will go immediately to the next presenter, Tara Sinclair, from the George Washington University. Tara, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Per. Let me just move this little box so it's not blocking the slides there. Hopefully you can see those now. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this panel. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And in a particular, I am a faculty member in the economics department at George Washington University, but I've also been working for the last several years as part of the economics research team at job website Indeed. And so I have this kind of mutual perspective of both really, really wanting private sector data and to be able to use it for academic research. And now one of my main initiatives is getting the data in the hands of policymakers. But at the same time, having worked on that project from the inside of a private company, I have kind of a unique view on some of the issues. So let me just dive in to just highlight some of my thoughts and concerns. So first of all, I think just starting out with this perspective that we really think that the people who are most skeptical of private sector data are the ones who have spent the most time really digging deeply into that data. This is a tweet by Martha Gimbel, who used to work as part of the Indeed Hiring Lab, and it's talking about a previous comment that Jed Kolko, who is the chief economist of Indeed, had said. And this is something that's a common theme in our discussions. Doing economic research with the Indeed data is, when is this representing economic trends and when is this representing the business? And how do we separate those two things and really be able to say something about the economy broadly, because that's what we're interested in as economists. So I remember when I first started working with private sector data a little over 6 years ago, and I really thought it was going to be this holy grail. Everybody who said, anytime they heard that I had access to Indeed data, everybody's like, oh, that's amazing. You're going to have so many research papers. It's going to be so, changing the world. And I really do see a lot of promises to this data. And I'm going to highlight two of them, the timeliness and the granular. I think that's particularly important in this crisis, and I'll come back to those in just a moment. But of course, they're also, potentials for innovative new research and this observational view rather than surveys. And we have the sense that they might be inexpensive because they're piggybacking on existing data collection. However, once we really started digging into working with the data, rather than looking like a holy grail, it does look much more like an actual archaeological dig, where we're having to really grab small shards of things and put them together. And so just briefly to cover some of the perils, and happy to talk about these more in much greater detail later, but business use and public use are two very different things. Businesses have their own incentives, and the data and the way it's collected and stored for the business use might cost a lot of money to transition into something that's useful for policymakers. And so without the right incentives for businesses to do that, the data that they collect may not be useful in the way that we imagine. Furthermore, there's unclear accountability. We've already talked a lot in this conference about when data is representative or not, and really it's rarely representative, and so it's hard to determine what the right weights would be, what the right benchmarks are. A lot of these data, particularly some of the new stuff that's come out for addressing the recent economic shifts in light of the coronavirus, really lack history. And also, even when they do have a longer history, they may not be consistently measured over time, and they may not be compatible with other economic definitions. So following on that, there are lots of changing definitions, and the business definition could be very different from the definition that we think of for economic purposes. And the data is incredibly unstructured. And so even if it's collected, doesn't mean that it's necessarily usable data. So let me just briefly hit a couple of things that I think are really interesting about coming into a crisis. I think this has actually made a lot of private companies more willing to share their data. They've seen how it can be valuable. And part of that is the timeliness of the data and just the eagerness that people have had to have access to more timely data. And I think there's going to be a longer term interest in the granularity of the private sector data. So just briefly, in terms of timeliness, I want to show an example of job postings on Indeed. I selected some countries that I thought might be relevant for some of the attendees here. And we can see that if we just track the trend over 2020 for these countries, if we look, February, March looked pretty much like what we were used to seeing. But then very quickly, as we hit mid-March, we started to see these trends just take a nosedive. That was like the scariest, like those lines, watching that graph every day. I would wake up really early in the morning and watch those graphs. It was really scary. And then they kept falling. And then, now as we're watching, now hopefully there's more optimism and we're looking to see how fast the recovery is happening in the different markets as we go along. So I think that timeliness is still important for measuring the recovery as well as for measuring that initial crisis drop. But we might also be super interested in thinking about the granularity of the data going forward. And I think, so I just want to share one cool example. I'll note that there was some research presented yesterday using Indeed data by the Bank of England. So I'll highlight a different project that was from the International Monetary Fund in their World Economic Outlook just last month. They took a dive into the Indeed data and it used some more granular slices, but also were able to do some cross-country comparison, some within-country analysis, some sector analysis, and all of this is super cool. But of course, things that we still need to be concerned about in using these granular data are thinking about the representativeness, how challenging it is to actually use the data, and of course, the relatively short history of that information. So I think those are all issues we need to continue to address in our research to be able to really get the most economic insights out of private sector data, such as the Indeed job postings. But another thing that I really liked about what the IMF did is they triangulated from many different data sources from the private sector. And I think that's really important so even if we've got a bunch of different data sets that are non-representative, and there's probably some commonalities in the ways that they're not representative, but still it gives me a lot more confidence in analysis if we're looking at different kinds of Google Trends, Google mobility reports, data from Vodafone, using all other cool sources of health data like the Oxford government response tracker data. I think that's something that we all need to think about. And I think it's easier for policymakers who can have large economic teams and can bring in a lot of data, might be better suited to do than an individual academic researcher might be capable of doing in their offices. So just to sum up, I still think that usually quality data is worth the wait, and quality data is, I think, typically produced by statistical agencies. And I don't want to lose sight of that. We always emphasize with the Indeed data that we think of it as a complement, not a substitute for any of the awesome heroes work that's being done by statistical agencies around the world. However, the speed in the crisis was really important for having this more timely data to track what was going on. And so I think that was really something that, getting those big, scary numbers in the hands of policymakers, I really felt like that was, helping to speed the response and therefore to support the global economy. But in the longer term, I think these granularity gains are really important and really exciting areas for future research. But one thing I will really highlight here at the end is that I think we need to be careful not to cherry pick or to be drawn in by anomalies, right? If we have a certain thing we want to show and we pick the particular private sector data that highlights that result that we want, I don't think that that's a valid approach for research. And I think with all of these proliferating data sources, we are particularly at risk of that, and we need to keep that in mind. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much. And we have lots of Hiring Lab related research at hiringlab.org.
Right, thank you very much. And we can see we're generating questions in the chat, so this is very good, but we will save them for the Q&A session. So let's move on to the next presenter, Stephen Hansen from the Imperial College London. Steve, the floor is yours.
And Steve has the ball.
Thanks. All right. All right, we've been talking a little bit about unstructured data. I may get this somewhat unstructured presentation because I'm really just trying to start a sort of a conversation here. So I'm grateful to the first two presenters because they've kind of made some of the background points that I guess we're all sort of aware of in the last 6 months. So I think, one thing that's been clear is that, there's been some arguments that COVID-19 has accelerated pre-existing trends in a few directions, like, movement towards e-commerce or whatever. I think there was also an underlying trend for, interest in non-traditional data. Obviously, this conference has been, I think this is the second year you guys have been doing it, right? So there's been some interest for a while in this, but this has really accelerated the collection of all kinds of new data sources. And I do want to make a kind of an upfront distinction between intentionally collected data, where I think we've also seen innovation during COVID-19. You can now do surveys pretty cheaply. So a lot of influential research has been survey-based. But then there's also been this interest in happenstance data, which was not intentionally collected, but that we think ex post is kind of useful, right? So mobility data, financial transaction data, energy consumption, things like this, all these high frequency non-traditional indicators. So if I want to make one point in this panel, it was based on my personal experience during COVID. And the one point I want to make is, if you believe these are powerful resources, you need to think carefully about where they're going to come from in your policy institution, because these things don't just drop from the sky for you to start analyzing. The amount of work that goes into building the relationships you need to do this kind of thing is something you need to think about well in advance of actually anticipating to use the data, okay? So for me, the big challenge here is not really statistical or, hiring a bunch of machine learning experts or getting a cloud computing infrastructure in your central bank. It's building the relationships over the medium and long term with the private sector that you're going to need if you want to use this happenstance data. So these views were shaped by two separate relationships two separate engagements that I was participating in during the crisis. One was with BBVA. I've noticed Alvaro and Tomasa are on the panel, so hello guys. Another one was a group convened at the Royal Society, which is the UK's National Academy of Sciences, that was sort of supposed to be a data-driven response to the crisis. Okay, so they had all these kind of experts from DeepMind and stuff who were going to kind of solve the crisis with data. All right, so I don't really need to say why. Sorry, I should say I'm going to be talking about happenstance data from this point on. So not these like real-time survey measures, but if we want to use private sector data, why might we want to do it, and what are the challenges? Well, as Tara has just said, there are kind of two, broadly speaking, advantages of happenstance data. You can do real-time stuff. I often find that academics are less interested in the real-time nature of some of these indicators than policymakers. So there's probably policy interest, or certainly if you're trading in a financial market, for example, you care about daily data. I think most academics can live with weekly data or monthly data. I think one thing that happenstance data adds to the mix beyond the frequency is the granularity and working out the distributional and local impacts of some of these shocks. Okay. I should also say, from a kind of broader perspective, I think COVID has sort of, people are really interested in doing real-time tracking. I think the longest term impact of some of these data sets might be as inputs into national statistics. So Tara has mentioned the complementarity between private and public sector, this happenstance data and the traditional surveys that national statistics institutes do. I think especially in maybe lower income countries, the balance may tilt more towards happenstance data. So you may actually get higher quality indicators from the private sector in middle and low income countries than in official surveys, where they're more expensive to run and they potentially miss more parts of the economy than in a developed place like the US. All right, so now, what are the challenges in using this data? So there was something kind of deeply ironic in my experience in the Royal Society about having some of the world's experts in machine learning. And I'm talking about like people who gave keynote lectures at the NIPS conference, right? So top ML guys who were supposed to be using data sets to help the government. And then you can't really get off, first base because you run into these constraints with the private sector that are just very difficult. So establishing a common language and a vocabulary to even describe the kind of data that you want, putting systems in place to collect that data in a consistent, replicable way is very difficult. Oftentimes banks are sitting on a bunch of data, but it's completely unorganized. And we're talking tens of millions of dollars have to be invested to put it in databases that external academics can use in a way that's sort of transparent and replicable. Rigorous anonymization protocols are not that easy to design. There are these kind of naive assumptions that I can just stick some key between 1 and 20 million next to every customer and then publish it. But you quickly realize that there are all kinds of clever ways that you can back out personal information if you don't think about this carefully. So the point is all of these things have to be thought about before data can be shared. They're costly, they're time consuming, and I would say they're poorly incentivized. So most academics aren't going to get tenure by solving these problems. And I think when you go into banks, a lot of middle managers are not going to get promoted in banks for solving these problems. So you often get to a stage where the CEO of a company talks to somebody and says, yeah, let's do this project with this academic. But then you're talking with middle managers whose job it is to deploy this, and it's just extremely difficult, okay? So there have been some success stories during COVID, all right? And the first two, I think, are good for people who are lucky enough to have them. The third, I think, is worth thinking about for those of you who are interested in doing this. So certain big banks actually have standalone research institutes. And their incentive to work with policymakers and academics is that people who work in these places kind of have an intellectual engagement with the data, including BBVA Research, where Alvaro Tomasa comes from, the JP Morgan Institute in the US. But again, these institutes have been built up over years, right? They didn't just come into fruition in February. The reason they could contribute to COVID-19 is because these big investments had been made ex ante. There's another set of the private sector that I think has a reputational incentive to share data, and that's sort of startups and fintechs. So when you think about Raj Chetty's platform in the US, and to which I put a link here, and also a similar very interesting effort at the Riksbank in Sweden, a lot of fintech companies want to sign up for data sharing because it helps their brand recognition, right? So there's this sort of ethos of helping the world that operates here. But notice these fintech companies that are sharing data, they have made the ex ante investments in how to organize data, anonymize data, and collect it in a replicable way, because that's their business model, right? And again, those investments were made far before the crisis. So the third example that I've put here, I think is very interesting, and I think it comes closer to how data sharing is going to evolve in practice. So for those of you, I'm sorry, Per made a prediction that I was incapable of giving a 5-minute talk. So Per, am I already hitting 10 minutes? Do I need to stop or?
You're doing wonderfully, but you're past your 5 minutes, but go on.
Go on.
For those of you who haven't seen it, the Spanish National Statistics Institute, which is INE, has an amazing mobility data set. So this thing blows Google out of the water. So they have defined many regions in Spain. In some cases, this is down to like the 1 square kilometer level. And they have a complete dyadic flow data set that they publish every day of how many people went from one small little area of Spain to another. This is data that is based on 80% of Spanish mobile phones. And it's been an important input into epidemiological models. So there's various nature and science publications that already draw on it. Now, how is it that the National Statistics Agency in Spain published this data and is able to? This story goes all the way back to 2009, when Telefonica started collaborating with the Mexican government during the Mexican shutdown during H1N1. So when the Mexican government locked down in 2009, they thought, wouldn't mobility data from mobile phones be useful for us? So they started a little kind of collaboration with Telefonica, which then inspired the Spanish government to make similar investments. So for 10 years, the Spanish government has been working with the data science team at Telefonica to build up these indicators. They ended up paying for data from the private sector, so that when the crisis came, they had this wonderful resource. If you want to see this story, watch this YouTube video of the woman who kind of organized this. It's very interesting. All right, so policy recommendations, and then I stop. If you think that happenstance data is useful, I'm not sure that there's a market solution to generating data sharing, just because private incentives aren't really aligned with the public good. So what do we know from standard economic theory? If something's a public good, there's a strong rationale for the government to get involved. And I would say that if you as a central banker, I assume most people are from central banks now, if you think this is important going forward, think about building the relationships that you need with the private sector, maybe even before you hire data scientists, because ingesting this data is a big challenge, and the time to make these investments is now. It's not wait for the next crisis. It's try to anticipate that this data is going to be useful, take the steps that you need over a time period of years to build these things up. Okay? Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Steve. That was very entertaining and also insightful. There's also questions in the chat, in particular for your link to YouTube. So you might share this while the next speaker is preparing himself. So the next speaker is Giuseppe Bruno from our host, Bank of Italy. Please, Giuseppe.
Okay, thank you very much, Per.
You have the vote, Giuseppe?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you?
Yes, we can hear you. We don't see your screen.
You don't?
You have to share. Open the PowerPoint and share it.
Let me see. Okay. Okay. And
Perfect.
now you should.
Yes, we see it. Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to the chairman, Per. And, let me add some of the points that have been already raised by all the previous panelists. And of course, I will provide some indication of the path that has been followed by the Bank of Italy in the last, say, 4 to 5 years. First of all, even considering, and of course, I agree, I already discussed in the chat, of the difficulty in taking advantage of private data, I think it is still very relevant to stimulate, to foster the process of moving towards a data-driven organization. In order to do that, we need to define a path which starts, first of all, by removing organizational silos and going to a data-driven institution that is able to take advantage of all its data, all the data that already are inside the central bank, especially for credit, for balance sheet, for household survey, and all the other surveys that are already carried out by central banks. And of course, in order to do that, we need to optimize the trade-off that we have between data security and true data analytics, because of course there are problems, as Stephen was mentioning, in realizing a true anonymization. So of course it is not enough just removing fiscal code, removing this number, and it's not enough just generalization in, say, in area or in a particular group of data. That is another research thread, the privacy computation and multi-site privacy computing. Of course, we have a rich web of data that are aside central bank that can provide us useful insights. And we have seen that, we have experienced that in the last 4 years, for example, using Twitter data, using data from newspaper, like we have taken advantage of Factiva. But in order to do that, we have to grapple with the huge data set. And in order to do that, we have developed and we are developing new hardware and software platform. So this is relevant. And of course, when it is not enough for a central bank to develop this platform, of course, we have to consider recurring to cloud. So we have to take into account that there are platforms that allows us to do higher computation at higher scale that is not possible to run inside the central bank just for financial constraints. And of course, we have to mix the different skills. We have already talked about multidisciplinarity, and many other papers and presenters have talked about this. And I think that the only possible avenue to achieve very good, efficient statistics is the one of putting together economists, statisticians, mathematicians, so this kind of different skills. As far as the non-traditional sources that we have considered in the last few years, we have many of those that are that have been described in these 2 days, especially Twitter's and the Dow Jones Factiva for global news and articles. We have also taken advantage of real estate agency, which is immobiliare.it, which is a kind of Zillow website for Italy, where we find about I would say 70-80% of the real estate market in Italy for both purchase and renting apartment for commercial and residency reason. Then we have Mutui Online, that is just a bank's mortgage brokerage, where you can compare the mortgage that are offered by more than 30 banks in just a few clicks, introducing your data, like number of children, like annual income. So you put some data and then you get all the ranking of banks that can provide you mortgage. And of course, we have started collecting granular payments for credit and debit cards. And I say started because, of course, I'm aware of what has been said by Tara and by Stephen, that having this kind of data is not just something that like a CSV file that you pick from one place and then you can use it. No, we have, of course, to consider that the technological platform who use this data for clearing payments have different purposes than those from a central bank. So we had to work with them for different months, I would say almost a year, in order to be able to arrive at the point where we can use a data set that provides about 30-35 gigabytes of data per month. For example, for only for Visa, then another 35 for MasterCard, then we have another about the same amount for Bancomat, which is the main circuit, technological circuit for debit card. Then, of course, we have taken advantage of textual data from Bank of Italy publication. We have many kind of report for financial stability and the final report, the annual report that is given by the governor every year. Here I provide just a very rough indication of the fraction, the data sharing that we have, and the kind of how can distribute the analytical effort with respect to the amount of data. So in order to build, for example, confidence indicator towards the banking system, or to provide economic policy uncertainty, we have used this kind of technical data analytics, like neural networks, and those are the, according to our experience, the greatest data eaters. With this data intensity. Then we have for the confidence indicators, we have another 20% of all our data that are taken from newspaper, from articles, magazine, and also for building an economic policy uncertainty index. We need another high fraction of our data, and the rest are almost equally distributed between nowcast and forecast, so about 10% of the data that are used for nowcast and forecast. And here, among the various data that we consider, we have also digital image that we are dealing with the artificial neural network for working with the banknote classification. That is, of course, a task more oriented towards central banks. So what are our future perspectives? What do we expect from the future? So first of all is that central banks and the other banks, also the commercial banks, will strengthen their data management process in the next few months, and this is done in order to ensure that we are able to collect the relevant data, and not only to collect, but as also the other panelists have said before, also to make them available and exploitable to the other researchers inside the central bank. Then, of course, valuable inside consideration can be taken from this information, especially when they come from different organizations that are outside of government. We have already talked about private organizations. So we want to take information from trade organization, industry, utility, like telephone company, or energy or power supply. And also we can imagine coalition of data by cross industry. And we are already assisting this kind of coalition for, of course, for cream screening the consumer. I mean, for taking more information from the consumer. So the final point is that data should go democratized wherever possible. Wherever possible. Of course, I share some of the doubts raised by Stephen. Yes, and of course, the final point is to increase cooperation among central institutions and the private sector. And this is the important policy action. And these are the final considerations. So, keeping experimenting in the NLP field, sharpening the accuracy of our econometric forecast, and evaluation and comparative analysis of a statistical indicator achieved by taking advantage of web data. Okay, thank you very much. Per.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Very insightful. And please follow the chat. There's a lot of questions. There are also answers. So there's a lively debate going on at the same time.
Okay.
So feel free to join the debate. Let's go to the next speaker and the final speaker for the panel, and then we start the Q&A afterwards. So the next speaker is Marco Marini from the IMF. Please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Per. I assume you can hear me well. Good afternoon, and thanks to the organizers from the Bank of Italy and the Federal Reserve for inviting me in this exciting panel discussion. I'm very happy to go last because I think I'm gonna sort of offer a solution to this private-public sector partnership, at least what we find at the IMF. So my presentation, I will obviously have this slide, and I will talk about different aspects that you can see here. My presentation will be about the work that we are doing at the IMF to strengthen public and private collaboration on data. I'm going to talk about the Development Data Partnership, which is an initiative in collaboration with the World Bank and an Inter-American Development Bank that sees, as of now, 24 companies making their data available for staff in the three organizations. So we have known for some time now that more timely, granular, and accurate information, such as that collected by the private sector, like transportation providers, mobile network operators, or social media companies, or job posting companies like Indeed, could dramatically increase the efficiency and effectiveness of public service and policy advice. However, there are barriers that limit the ability of governments to access, understand, and responsibly use such data. On the supply side, firms may not know how their data could support public needs. And also the lack of internationally accepted standards for data, licensing, privacy, and security make the cost of data sharing very, very high. So on the demand side, there are many disaggregated stakeholders with varying level of technical capacity, and companies are often challenged to vet every single request. So the Development Data Partnership tried to resolve this market failure between proprietary data and public demand. So how we did so? The partnership is founded on multiple pillars. First, we developed a legal framework, which resulted in a master data license agreement used by the three organizations with our data partners. Then we developed a secured and shared IT infrastructure to ingest, store, and access the data. Next, we use the principle of responsible data use, whereby we commit as international organizations to use the data for public goods. We also developed a web-based portal on which potential users from the three institutions can browse the data opportunities and make their proposals. Next, the importance of multidisciplinary teams, as Giuseppe said, to ingest, process, and analyze massive amounts of data, which has to include economists, data scientists, and IT specialists. And finally, the idea of creating and sharing data goods and reusable code. As you can imagine, setting up this model was not an easy task. We worked for more than 2 years to design and build this model. So I do truly believe what Stefan said, that these things take a lot of time. And I think the greatest achievement of this partnership is really to have created a new data sharing model that works for both public and private sector companies. A model that hopefully can provide an example for other public organizations who aspire to use an efficient and effective way to access private sector data. So how does it work in practice? So first, each organization like IMF, IDB, and World Bank signs a data license agreement with each partner. So this agreement specifies which data sets are made available to the partnership, including their terms and conditions. Then the second step, our staff submit proposals through this web-based portal that is accessible from our organizations, and these proposals are reviewed from the other side by our data partners. So they can see this proposal and accept them. So when the proposal is accepted, the data are then transferred securely to a shared infrastructure, which is managed by the World Bank on behalf of the three organizations. And then access is facilitated to the approved users. And finally, of course, our goal is the production of data goods, reusable code, and insights that can be produced sustainably. So an important point that we have learned is that many companies, of course, are excited to see how their data can solve a public challenge. However, there are three conditions that have to be met. So first, the partnership cannot compromise the privacy of its customers and neither their own sort of operations. Second, the partnership requires no work on their part. And finally, it has to bring benefits for both sides, even for them. So our system is sort of designed to meet these criteria. So you may wonder, so how do we match the data to the public sector use case? So when our staff go to these portals, they can use, they can explore data sets and services available from data partners and submit proposals for the use. When we sign the agreement, we never know in the beginning all of these sort of potential use cases. It's our staff that decide how to use the data. Then these proposals are received by our data partners in one place for their review and approval. So in this way, the partners have control over their data's use and can track projects over time and across multiple organizations at any given time. Through the system also, data partners learn new use cases for their data, right? Which can inform also their future products. And governments can learn new ways to inform their most important decision. I think these are tangible benefits on both sides. So in summary, so I think we have created a market linking private data to public use cases. And we have made this experience for both data partners and staff of our organization as easy and transparent as possible. Another important point that I want to highlight again is the principle of responsible data use. So we implement responsible data use in 3 ways: secure handling of the data, ensuring compliance with the terms of our data license agreements, and ensuring that data are used for the intended public good use cases. So on security, as I mentioned, data partners transfer data only once, and the partnership team facilitates access. In this way, at any given time, we know which staff have access to which data, for what purpose, and for how long. On license compliance, we have a few checks. First, after a data partner approves a proposal, the team must agree to the terms and conditions of the data license agreement. And we make clear, for example, whether data and insights can be shared with third parties and under what conditions. Only when we can see in our system that the team members agree to these terms, we facilitate data access. And to ensure that the intended use case is reasonable, only proposals that are accepted both by the international organization and data partner are granted permission to move forward. Also, after a team submit proposal, it's posted on our site for every staff member of all the organization to see, and this is all transparent. Finally, since the goal of our partnership is to produce data goods, we monitor each project to collect these products and story, and in doing so, we can ensure that the data are being used as intended. Now, this is just the beginning. As we all said in this panel, the pandemic has uncovered enormous gaps between countries in data. And we hope to see more and more partners joining this partnership to help resolve these gaps. I also want to say mention that we are very grateful for indeed Tara indicated the data that we use in our World Economic publication. Indeed, is not part of the partnership. You don't see it in the current data partners, but of course they've been very helpful in sort of giving this data to analyze the effect of the pandemic. So thanks very much to Tara for facilitating this access. For those of you who is interested in learning more about this project, I encourage you to visit our website, datapartnership.org, and of course now I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, thanks again for the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Back to you, Per.
Thank you for this elaborated and very nice model for collaboration of partnership between private and public partnership. So thank you very much to all the panel members. These were very insightful, and I can see and continue the chat goes on. So now I would like to start the Q&A session. And there were so many insightful propositions in the various presentations. But let me just make 3 points for my first question until we start. So first, when we are talking about data sharing, we are actually talking about data interoperability. So it really means giving access machine to machine to data, but there's only one master copy that is located at one place. If that is the case, and we're talking about open data, then it's a matter about fostering borderless sharing of digital data. So borderless interoperability of data. And that means that, of course, that anything, of course, everyone has to be compliant with the regular general data protection regulations. And this is, of course, still feasible today because there are methods to anonymize data, and there's also methods to microaggregate data. So one can still provide access via data operability cross-border following these methods that exist, and of course in full compliance with the data protection regulations that there is in place. Now, in this modus, early this year, also the European Commission, they launched a public consultation for a European strategy for data. Now, according to this European strategy for data, what do you believe, so this is some questions to the panel, what are the two main barriers you actually see for interoperability or sharing of data cross-border? And what are the enablers, question 2, what are the enablers for fostering collaborations among private and public entities, including also, of course, academia? Question number 1 to the panel members, please. Panel members, you can raise your hand. What are the barriers for sharing data, and what are the enablers for fostering collaboration among public and private entities?
I can jump in here just from the private sector perspective, right? So I was waiting. I thought maybe somebody from like the policymaker perspective might step in first, but you know, I think, and actually, I think an example of so why is Indeed not part of IMF's broader you know, collaboration at this point? I think this is a good example of those sorts of challenges for private sector collaborations, particularly with policymakers, is because you know, the data that are collected by companies in general, some of them are using it for data products, but a lot of them are using it for their own internal product work that's separate from the data product. And so to find a way to both curate it to be something that's of interest to policymakers, and also to address all of the different legal challenges around anonymization and removing any PII from that data. We're at this challenge where there's some government regulations that are coming in that are making it harder to share data and get the right legal agreements. At the same time as there are other pushes and incentives for the government different governments to encourage data sharing. And I think those things sometimes cancel each other out up to a point.
I can maybe jump in and say one further thing. When I look around Europe, it's also very interesting. I mean, I think there's some kind of pure economic arguments, right? That I think data sharing is in theory possible. It's just about making the investments into the technology to make that happen. So I very much enjoyed the last presentation that kind of puts this roadmap out about how data sharing could happen. But somebody still has to make those investments, right? And you know, firms will make those investments if the return on them is positive and not if not. So I think some of the question is just about what are the returns to investing in those infrastructures. And I think for larger, older banks, for example, the return on that investment is much lower than for a young, nimble startup whose whole business model is sort of built around organizing, sharing data. So I've been struck by just the large heterogeneity in the reaction of financial institutions for sharing data. Even in Spain, for example, the experience with BBVA is completely different than other Spanish banks. So yeah, I'll just.
Any other panel members that would like to? Marco, please.
Yes, yeah. Well, you know, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's really important for you know, the private sector companies to sort of to limit you know, their work, right, on their part, right, and so like in the past, we used to have a lot of sort of stuff, for example, approaching, big tech companies like Google and, Facebook to receive their data. And of course, on the other hand, they would see all these sort of multiple parties coming from the same organization. I mean, for them, it costs, right, to go into sort of a discussion, understanding the data sets and making the data accessible to them. I think so. So the model that I showed is really to sort of really make sure that this cost on their side is really, really minimized. So I think that's one factor that can create a barrier, the cost for them, to share the data. And in terms of enablers, definitely they need to see an incentive. Some of these big sort of tech companies, of course, have an incentive to share their data because their data is actually our data, right? So they have the position of where we go, what we sort of do, and so in a sense they have the sort of pressure to share anonymized, aggregated data for public insights. But also you have those sort of small companies that perhaps have an incentive, also a market incentive, right? Because again, if they collaborate with the IMF, with the bank, with the central bank, in a sense it raises their profile, right? And so they could actually generate some sort of market interest in their product that they can sell perhaps to other sort of private sector companies or even to other parts of the government. So in a sense, it's you always need to give back something to the private sector. Otherwise, it would be it's just not giving data, right? And also making sure that if you get access to the data, they know why you want the data and they know what kind of insights you provide, because you're not purchasing data here. It's not a commercial transaction, right? So you really want to get access for public goods, as I mentioned in my presentation.
Thank you very much. Is there any other panel members who would like to contribute? Otherwise, we will continue with the questions.
Well, I can say a few things. First of all, I think that, as Marco was saying, that with the small company, we have been able to find agreements, and I think it's doable even for further agreement getting this kind of data. With the big company, of course, I think even central bank, national central bank, needs cooperation with other central banks or maybe other international organizations, because I don't think national central bank has in a position to negotiate with Google. I mean, or with Twitter, for example. So with Twitter, they have a contract for adhesion. So you have to adhere to their standard, and you have to pay a certain amount of data. So on that point, I really appreciate the initiative that has been put forward by IMF, and I hope that this initiative can provide access also to national institutions, even if I don't know.
I mean, is it completely unthinkable that we could think of a market for data where governments buy, that basically make these investments on behalf of the private sector? I mean, we just spent I don't know how many hundreds of billions on furlough schemes. If we think data is important, it doesn't seem completely outside the realm of possibility that those investments would be taken by the public sector, right?
Well, if I may, I believe there's Per, you're on mute. Do you want to jump in?
No.
Oh, okay. No, I believe that I think the problems that statistics agencies and I guess also central banks face is that they invest their own sort of resources for kind of traditional ways of doing statistics, right? Surveys and partly administrative data. So like I guess that if you had to buy data from the private sector, which I guess quality aspects of private data could be questionable about kind of bias, selection bias, and things like that. So there is a risk that you deviate resources from your traditional data into something that may not guarantee the same sort of level of quality. So I think that discussion needs to take place where some resources perhaps can dedicate also for sort of market data, say. But I think again, you mentioned this idea of data that sort of are collected by itself. You call them sort of not service, but kind of data that are already available, that are collected automatically. That kind of data, right? So sometimes are not used by these companies, right? And so they are available for public insight. So really, the process here is really should be able to kind of access those data and make sure that they're available for those that are in need for them for public policy.
Thank you. Thank you for having that additional insight. That's important. Of course, it's all about fostering collaboration, and of course, that is what everyone tries to do. In Europe, we also try to foster collaboration, but if it doesn't work, we then issue a regulation enforcing both public and private firms to release their data with an API, so that's available. That's the intention with the European strategy for digital data. So that is probably what is going to happen. But anyway, let's go to the questions that has also been asked about public and private partnership. And maybe we have here Tommaso and also Alvaro from BBVA. Maybe you would like to share your model for this.
Yes, I want to make some comments on the discussion that is pretty interesting. Thank you, Stephen, for placing us as a good collaborator, but I will try to defend the position of the industry. First, to tell to Marco that he says that one of the requests is that the partnership doesn't want to work. For us, it's totally the opposite. What we request in the first place is that we want to be involved in the project of research. In other case, we don't provide the data. And we don't provide the data because you are talking about the data democracy, the democratization of the data, but in most of the cases, what you request is not only data. It is also work, skills, money cost. For example, when you ask me for my indicators of consumption, of investment, it took 2 years to develop this. A lot of Tomás is there, a lot of skills to process the data, because this data is not an Excel framework. It is something that you have to process. It is very, very costly. So, I mean, this question that you come to us, please give me the data that I will make the research and I will put you in a footnote in a graph. I think it is not a win-win position to collaborate. So what we try to do is to get involved, to talk with the researchers, and we participate with the BIT, with the Stephen, with the CAF, with the OECD, with whatever organization. We are very happy to do it because our name is BBVA Research, so it is in our DNA and in our name. But I mean, you have to take into account that what we are exchanging is not only raw data. Raw data never exists, so it's something that to be processed. So I think that we have to break silos and to enhance the collaboration in the researchers in the central bank and ministries and the private sector. For us, it is very important, this collaboration. Why? Because one big part of our job is cross-validation of what we are doing is right, to mimic the national accounts in real time. And we work with ministries, with experts there to cross this validation. So there are a lot of fields for win-win positions and collaboration. But I think that this topic should be treated from a symmetric way. I mean, that everybody has to be benefit. It is just maybe we're in a special case, but we request to be involved in the investigation.
Right.
I think, by the way,
Does
finally, that research is the first thing that I saw in collaboration in this topic during the last 5 years between the official and the public and the private sector. It was maybe, unfortunately, thanks to the COVID, but that everybody is looking at common positions of this to collaborate.
Is there any immediate reaction from the panelists? Any comments to this intervention from Aurora? Please, go ahead.
I have another comment. Okay, thank you, Per. Okay, thank you for the panel. It is a really interesting debate and for sure a topic that we should consider. That's true that during the last year and even more recently, we are seeing that these collaborations are increasing between private and public sector, but that's true that incentives is a key issue, but not the unique one. I would like to go to the regulation part because I think that the European Commission is taking a key role in that part. There are a lot of initiatives for trying to foster the use of the data sharing between public and private sector, and the European Commission is going to release it in the short term, I think in 2021 and in 2022, some regulations in order to try to define a framework that regulate this data sharing between private and public institutions in order to foster a collaboration, and even it is not clear if it is going to be compulsory or not. Because here an important issue is that, for example, imagine a National Institute of Statistics that they are doing the public statistic with surveys, releasing surveys to the enterprises, and they have to compile these surveys. So why, given that right now we have a better infrastructure, we have better data, more granular and more rich data, why these private institutions does not have to give the data for these reasons? So probably this is a debate that should be taken into account. Moreover, for the financial sector, it is going to also to have a regulation by 2022, in order to share the data with for reporting and supervising with authorities, but also with other banks. So the world is going to that point, to share the data and democratizing the data sources. And we should take this into account because this is an important point that we need to discuss. It is incentives, but also with public institutions, probably it is going to be even a task. Because in the past, there is another important issue and even more urgent, that is data governance. Private institutions that not have all of them a good data governance. And if they don't have it, if they don't have this information clear on the table, they could not rely on a data sharing model that is going to be success. And this is also a point that I would like to highlight and to ask for your opinion, because in order to see models where public institutions are going to access data from private institutions, they need to have a good data governance that compile all the regulatory issues, the legal issues, in order to share this data. If not, we cannot do anything.
Thank you for that elaboration. And of course, if we don't share, it will be a regulation that will force us to share, and that is also what is happening with the Payment 2 directive that imposes this on the banking community. So this is very well taken on board. So any feedback to this? Otherwise, I would just have a quick feedback from Andreas de Monaco. Very nice name, Monaco. Andreas del Monaco. You have something you would like to raise about data is the new oil? Would you like to ask something to the panel on this? Please unmute yourself and raise your question.
Andrea, you can talk.
One more time. 3, 2, 1. We go to the next question. So the next question, and we got Ellen back. So thank you very much, Ellen, for joining us back again. So if we are in public institutional central banks, and we are starting to use these new alternative data sources, not only in experimenting, but as a toolkit in our monetary policy, what are our two main communication challenges that we will have if we are using these alternative sources?
Well, it seems to me that there are confidentiality issues. So can we reference data publicly in our remarks and say, for instance, how it is that we collect the information that we do. You know, we're used to, as central banks, speaking very openly about, you know, what's going on in the labor market, what's going on with economic activity, and referencing those data, whether it's in testimony or press conferences, or at the Fed, we produce twice a year a lengthy monetary policy report for the Congress that's actually required by law. And we have, if you go look at those reports, we have many, many charts and tables in that report. So are we able to reference these data, or do confidentiality agreements mean that we can't show the data? Part of public trust, I think, in our institutions comes from showing that we're experts, you know, that we have a command over the data and the technical aspects of the economy. And so I think the graphs and the tables support that that way that we like to communicate with the public. So I think a second issue, and this maybe doesn't go directly to your question, but when we do communicate about the data, are we then making an advertisement for a private sector entity? We generally, and I'm speaking obviously from my perspective here at the Fed, but you know, we had greatly curtailed in the Dodd-Frank Act after the global financial crisis the way we could set up 13.3 facilities, so that we did not favor individual entities. We had to go for a collection of entities, and there were questions about our purchases of mortgage-backed securities starting in the global financial crisis, of whether or not we were then giving support to the housing sector, and was it right for the Federal Reserve to support a particular activity in the economy. And I think the same thing could be said of data initiatives, that, you know, if we purchase data from a vendor or various banks, which we do actually, and Google and Amazon, are we implicitly giving business to those companies? And what are we, you know, we've never had to worry about these issues, obviously, when data providers were government and official institutions with international agreements on the standards for collecting the data. So I think these are really a new world for us. I can stop now and let you ask somebody else.
Anyone else in the panel who would like to add to this, the communication channel of using these alternative sources?
Yes, I would like to add something about reputation. So we need to, first of all, to gain trust internally, even ourselves, that we are getting more accurate results using this data. So the fact that we want to use, say, Twitter data for producing inflation report, first of all, I do feel sympathetic with what Ellen was saying, that of course we can't sort of give any advantage to any of the private companies. But aside from that, that is of course an issue. Of course, we need to be sure that the use of this data produce a reliable measure. And
yes,
we are not there.
Yes, that's correct. There is an issue about reputation and the use of unreliable, not high quality data, of course, in central banking. Good. Any other questions? So now we have 2 minutes left of this panel Q&A session. So anyone in the audience who would like to raise a question, please just take the microphone and raise your question. There's 2 more questions we can take. We've got 2 minutes.
Attendees cannot unmute themselves. They have to raise their hand or say that.
Okay, there is a question from Yuri. Yuri, we cannot hear you.
No,
There is something with your microphone we cannot hear.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me? There was some...
Not very much. You have to
now,
go to
can you hear me?
the setting.
No?
Yes,
No?
yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now. Go on, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask you one thing to Marco Marini, because it's more on the regulation, if you want, on the legal framework, because you have done a great job at the IMF with the World Bank in the IDB, but of course you are all international organizations. Do you think that as central banks, for example, in Southern Europe or Northern Europe, with different legal frameworks, can we do something similar? Because I guess that you are in an international organization, you work in an international organization, so I think legal framework is a little bit easier for you than for Italy, Spain, France, Germany, you name it. Thank you.
Yes, Yuri. No, that's a very relevant question. I think the sort of doing what we did sort of across borders could be difficult because each country has its own regulation, and so this could be complicated. Maybe in the European Union or maybe even sort of kind of stricter in the euro area. Potentially, if you have the same regulation, this could be done. Perhaps like a partnership among like the central banks in Europe supported by the ECB. The other approach that one can take is really sort of a national perspective, right? So instead of doing a cross-border, you can actually have multiple organizations from the same country. I don't know, the statistics office, ministries, central bank, working together and develop such a system, because at the national level, I mean, all these organizations should have the same sort of kind of regulation on data privacy, data access. And so maybe that could be easier. So I see probably, developing these sort of more like interagencies between in the same country could actually be feasible. But again, it has to be sort of tested.
Okay,
Thank
but
you.
if I can add on that, it should be the international organization that should help us to have this cross-border, if you want, partnerships, right? Because of course, at the national level, I can do something for my country, as Ellen can do something for the US, and et cetera, et cetera. But at the international level, the international organization should try to help us, right?
No, I agree.
Yes.
I mean, but of course, all international organizations have different mandates, and these are legal aspects. And I'm not sure whether we can help in that regard at the IMF. But definitely, this is something that it's in our agenda. We would like also to leverage this experience and understand where we can do something for our membership.
Right. Thank you very much. So there is one more question. Arthur Torrell. Arthur Torrell, you have a question. Please unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you wish, and pose your question.
Arthur, I made you a panelist so you can unmute yourself.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, hi. I just wanted to say a little bit about our own experience in the Bank of England with some of these things. And maybe some of the other panelists can reflect on their own experiences. But particularly, we've had a very productive relationship with Indeed. And what Stephen Hansen said about starting early really rings true for us, because we first had discussions with Indeed about vacancy data back in 2016, believe it or not. And it took a long time to work out legal details, the data schema, to work out how the data could be used, and to actually get the data into the building, which can be a real challenge for central banks. So I just wanted to say that these things can be solved, but they take a long time and a lot of effort, but we've been happily receiving data throughout 2020. And one of the things that I'd like to push for more generally is standardization, which was also mentioned as well, across central banks, yes, but also within country too. And if the panel have any thoughts on how best to achieve that standardization, apart from the ideas we've already heard, I'd be really interested to hear them.
Thank you very much for sharing this with the participants. So now we are coming to a close. We're spilling a little bit 3 minutes over. So is there any quick reaction from the panel members that would like to add something that has not already been said? Thank you. it doesn't mean you shouldn't say anything. You say anything you would like to finish with, a short sentence before we move on to the next. 5, 3, 2, 1. Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your interventions and for sharing your insights with this audience. So thank you very much, Ellen Maid, Tara Sinclair, Steve Hansen, Marco Marini, and Giuseppe Bruno for sharing your insights. Also, thank you very, very much for Bank of Italy for organizing it together with the Federal Reserve Board. So this has been a wonderful panel. I learned a lot. So thank you very, very much for participating, sharing your insight, and for the questions and the lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to all of you. Thanks a lot.
Over to you.
Okay, and now John Stevens from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is going to give the concluding remarks, thanking, of course, all the attendees and the panelists and the presenters for making this event very great. Thank you, John. The floor is yours, and if you have to present something, you have the floor. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate the kind introduction. That panel was outstanding. I think it really highlighted a lot of important issues, and those are exactly the right conversations that we should be having. So I think this has been just a wonderful conference, a tremendous number of interesting papers. I very much enjoyed the presentations, the discussions. As I understand it, there were about 700 registrants this year, and attendance has been quite high. So this conference is clearly filling an important gap. So I'd like to start by thanking the organizing committee from the Bank of Italy and the Federal Reserve Board, Giuseppe Bruno, Yuri Marcucci, Ricardo Correa, and Chris Kurtz, as well as other individuals at both banks that made this conference possible. Of course, the success of this conference importantly reflects the active engagement of people from our global community of researchers from central banks, statistical agencies, and academia. So thank you to all of the presenters and to the session chairs. It's much appreciated. So broadly, the work at this conference fell into 3 buckets: projects with big or non-traditional data, applications of machine learning methods, and applications of NLP methods. And not surprisingly, many of the presentations discussed COVID-19, the role of these data and methods in the pandemic. I think there's little doubt that we've all benefited from the availability of timely, high-frequency data these past 9 months. I thought the presenters did an excellent job over the past 2 days employing tools in a manner that made their results understandable and interpretable. And that's commendable because some of these tools can yield results that are difficult to explain to policymakers or the public. So I know that takes some effort at times. The range of questions that were considered was impressive, and the answers were equally provocative. I know I've got a list of ideas and topics I want to follow up on as a result of the presentation, so I'm personally thankful for the work encompassed by this conference. In the time that I have left, I thought it might be useful to step back and discuss 3 general challenges we face, particularly when moving from individual research projects to things that can be used on a recurring basis, either in official statistics or in central bank analysis. And much of what I will say will mirror themes you heard from the panel a few moments ago. Importantly, each of these challenges will benefit from a cross-disciplinary set of clever minds working together to develop creative solutions. So the first challenge, in my mind, is to close the gap between traditional and non-traditional data. When developing a non-traditional measure that has a counterpart in official statistics, there is a tension between having your new measure be too similar to the old measure, to the official measure, because that limits its value added, and having it be too different from the official measure, as that suggests potential problems with the methodology or with the data. We can all think of examples of big data that, despite their scale, suffer from selection bias, and that was talked about a lot at this conference. In our economic measurement work with non-traditional data at the board, we've long grappled with this tension. I can remember many conversations about exactly this issue, and I recently heard it mirrored by Matthew Shapiro from the University of Michigan. In practice, I think there's been a tendency to gravitate toward new measures that aren't too different from the official measures, but that have another dimension that is not found in official statistics, such as being timelier, higher frequency, having greater geographic or industry detail, and so on. By matching an official measure along key dimensions, often in a fairly aggregate summary at the monthly or quarterly frequency, the non-traditional measure effectively inherits the official measure's credibility. Of course, just because the aggregate measures match, it doesn't mean the more granular information in the non-traditional measure is accurate, but by at least satisfying that aggregate constraint, it does boost one's confidence somewhat. There are, of course, other ways to resolve the tension between being too similar versus being too different. One common approach is not to compete and instead blend non-traditional data into official indicators. And our colleagues at statistical agencies around the world have active agendas to do just that. Some groups are using scanner data or web-based data to help measure consumer prices, for example, and others are using point-of-sale information to improve measures of consumer spending. Another common way to resolve the tension is to use official indicators to re-weight non-traditional data. And that's something that has been done with web scrape prices. It's something we do at the board with employment measures we derive from payroll processor data, and consumer spending measures we derive from aggregated card transactions. Importantly, though, that reweighting requires high-quality, low-frequency measures, which is something that only statistical agencies can do in a convincing fashion. Yet another way to resolve the tension is to go even bigger. If we can expand non-traditional data to be close to a population measure, then that eliminates selection bias, and provided the methodology is defensible, should engender confidence in the resulting measures. Suppose, for example, counterfactually, that all workers were paid through a third-party payroll provider. Then acquiring data from all payroll providers would eliminate the risk of selection bias that comes from working with just one provider's data. In practice, of course, those data sets will tend to be highly correlated, and so it's hard to justify in our environment the cost of getting a measure for the population if it involves bilateral negotiations with lots of parties, bespoke programs to make the data comparable, and all the other challenges that have been highlighted this afternoon. There's a lot of work, interesting work going on related to this challenge of closing the gap between traditional and non-traditional data, including by many at this conference, and we've only just scratched the surface. The second challenge is ensuring the long-term viability of work with non-traditional data. Establishing agreements with providers of non-traditional data can be time-consuming, complicated, and costly. And I fully agree with the comments Stephen made during the panel about investing in relationships. That's been a key component of our work at the Fed. Chris Kurtz, one of the organizers, has been instrumental in building a lot of those relationships. But even once an arrangement is successfully established, there are a multitude of risks, including hold-up problems and contract renegotiations, providers refusing to renew, and risks of disruptions in the receipt of data for technology or other reasons. For some economic measures, the non-traditional or big data we need are often quite concentrated, so diversification is rarely a means to mitigate these risks. Because the data often cover a large share of the economy, disruptions are more acute than when a survey struggles with non-response rates. As researchers, you of course understand the costs and risks associated with using non-traditional data and new techniques. From an institutional perspective, non-traditional data arrangements require investments of money and time for the data to be used productively, and those investments are largely sunk if the arrangement falls through. Consequently, if an institution depends on a particular data source for a statistical release or for recurring analysis, then some contingency planning may be appropriate. And I suspect contingency planning for data availability is not high on most of our to-do lists. Hold-up risk and the risk of other disruptions may be greater for public-private arrangements, so one way to avoid this challenge is to focus on government sources of administrative or non-traditional data where possible. In the US, a great example of leveraging administrative data comes from the Census Bureau's business formation statistics, which provides at a weekly frequency an early indication of new business formations based on applications for employer identification numbers, which are needed for tax purposes. Of course, sourcing data from the government is often not an option, and this is where I think there's room for some creative thinking to harness private data for the public good while still protecting privacy and confidentiality, which is a theme that came up quite often in the previous panel. Perhaps someone at this conference will figure out a way to rethink that fundamental value proposition for data providers in order to get their buy-in for economic measurement, or perhaps someone will devise an institutional arrangement inside or outside of governments that facilitates the creation of public statistical products. Solving this challenge could be transformative for the economic measurement community and those that depend on timely granular information. And so in that vein, I was very interested in the comments from Marco during this afternoon's panel and what the IMF is doing. I think it has a lot of interesting features. I think there's some challenges for some of us, but it is a very intriguing and promising effort. The last challenge relates back to some remarks that Senior Deputy Governor Franco made at the opening of the conference, and that's the importance of engaging on issues of privacy and confidentiality. In the US, the Census Bureau has been a leader in this area with its work to apply formal privacy methods to the decennial population census. As formal privacy methods are developed further and as understanding of these methods grows and diffuses, it is easy to imagine a future where it has an effect on a lot of non-traditional data work. I won't pretend to be an expert on this topic, but for those of you that are not familiar with formal privacy methods, they effectively make explicit the trade-off between privacy and the accuracy of the statistics you can derive from a database. As more statistics are generated, those statistics have to become less accurate to protect privacy. Now, if you know ahead of time what statistics you want to generate from a database, then the privacy protecting algorithms can be tuned to allocate more of that scarce privacy budget to those statistics. But it's really hard to anticipate what any of us are going to want further down the road. Therefore, it's going to be important for all of us, data producers and data users, researchers, to be a part of the conversations to ensure we develop data access and use methods that are practical and that help us get the most value possible out of the data while still protecting privacy. So to wrap up, the progress we made, that we will make on these three broad challenges will have implications for many of the interesting non-traditional data efforts, as well as the applications of machine learning and NLP techniques discussed at this conference. And I honestly can't think of a better group poised to make progress on these and other questions, and I look forward to continued collaboration among those represented here. And hopefully future conferences can be held in person. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Thank you everybody. I don't know if Giuseppe, you want to say the last word because I talk too much. But thanks to the panelists, thanks to the chairs, as I wrote in the chat. Thanks to all the presenters, all the chairs, all the attendees, all the participants in these 2 days. In both sessions, I hope that you enjoyed the conference. You know, Chris, Riccardo, Giuseppe, and I, we try to do our best to make the best of all the good submissions that we got. We got 140 submissions, and almost all of them were good. So it was really difficult also to pick up the program. Yeah. And thanks a lot. With some of you, we will see tomorrow in the closed session. I sent the program. If you didn't receive it, please email me or Giuseppe or Riccardo or Chris. And you know, well, thanks again, and I hope to see you in person in 2 years here in Rome for the follow-up conference. Even though remember that there will be another one next year in the US. I don't know if you want to say something else, Giuseppe.
I just want to say hello to everybody, to thank Dr. Stevens for his insightful consideration, and I hope we can put also his speech in our final wrap-up on the website. Okay. And okay, so thank you very much, and goodbye to everybody. And see you tomorrow for the other. Bye, Per.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Bye, Per. Bye, Tara.
Thank
bye,
you all.
Thank you, Riccardo. And,
thank you very much.
I think you might do a little bit, right?
No, we will meet tomorrow morning. Yeah.